Hey, everybody. It's time now for my Chapter 9 in Sociology presentation. Woo! Pay careful attention and make sure you wake up before the end because at the conclusion of Chapter 9, I'm going to give you all the tips you need to know for the first cumulative exam. Okay, today's topic is sexuality and society. Gore Vidal said, "A narcissist is someone who is better looking than you are." Okay, if you don't get that joke, Google narcissist. From the perspective of sociology, the focus here is on how society shapes human sexuality. Sex. It's not what you think. It's the biological distinction between males and females. In other words, there are differences between males and females' bodies, in case you haven't noticed. At birth, there are primary sex characteristics, which are genitals, organs used for reproduction, and at puberty onward, secondary sex characteristics, bodily differences apart from the genitals that distinguish biologically mature females and males. And some of these characteristics, of course, are unique to humans. For example, in most animals, the estrous cycle controls sexuality by making a female receptive to a male only at specific times. By contrast, human females are receptive according to cultural norms, their own decisions, and how much they just had to drink. I just threw that in there and tried to milk a laugh. Intersexual people refers to people whose bodies, including genitals, have both female and male characteristics. It's natural and very rare, well below 1% of a society's population. Transsexuals, people who feel they are one sex even though biologically they are the other. Sex as a cultural issue. As is described in the text, there's a great deal of cultural variation in sexuality and sexual practice. Sexual attitudes in the United States are quite mixed. Many people still view sexual conduct as an important indicator of personal morality, and yet sex is exploited everywhere in society. Why? Because sex sells. To give you another example, the Clinton sex scandals, liberals defended Clinton against what they saw as our tradition of oppressive Puritanism. Conservatives condemned Clinton as embodying that 1960s permissiveness. Once again, those damn hippies, how I hate them. The sexual revolution is described in the text as having started around 1910 and really took off after World War II, and especially during the 1960s. The technological impetus for this was the pill. Yes, I remember when the pill came out in the 1950s, it kind of changed everything about sex because there was no longer the concern of someone becoming pregnant. And at the time, there were only a few STDs, so that wasn't a big deal either. Not like today. All right, check out figure 9-1 about how the double standard in the United States regarding males and females and sex is narrowing. The 1994 study by Lawman that's cited in your text found that 54% of men claim to, quote, think about sex daily, unquote, but only 19% of women claim to. Well, I don't know. Most of the men I know think about sex minutely. The sexual counter-revolution described in the text explains our culture's ambivalence regarding sexual attitudes. Premarital and extramarital sex is also covered in the text. Check out table 9-1. Okay, this was a national opinion research survey asked about how often did you have sex in the last 12 months? So you can see where you're at on this scale. Not at all, 24%. Losers, excuse me, I was clearing my throat. 24%, no sex at all. Once or twice, 10%. Once a month, 11%. 2 to 3 times a month, 15%. Once a week, 14%. 2 to 3 times a week, 17%. More than 4 times a week, 5%. Don't know, 5%. How would you not know if you had sex? Well, this was another one of those, I can't figure this one out, but I'll wait and the answer will come to me. So one day I'm watching Rodney Dangerfield. You may recall him from Caddyshack. Anyway, he was a stand-up comedian. You know, his standard shtick was, you know, he'd tug at his tie and go, I don't get any respect. I got no respect. All right. So he's rolling through his routine and he tells a blue joke in the comedy trade known as a sex joke. He went blue. And so he gets done and all of a sudden he just sort of pauses and interrupts his routine and he gets kind of real somber and reflective. And he says, geez, I'll never forget the first time I had sex. Thinking back on it was maybe the most beautiful experience of my life. As I think back, the only thing I regret is there was nobody there to join me in it. So perhaps this 5% that didn't know are wondering, does partnerless sex count? How about an international survey? In a survey of 18,000 people in 27 different countries, adults reported having sex on average 96 times per year, a bit less often than twice a week. The survey found that people in Greece claim to have sex the most, about 138 times a year. They ought to put a set of horns on the Acropolis. See, horny, never mind. People in Japan claim to have sex the least often, only 45 times per year. 45 times per year. They must all be married. Yeah, you'll get that joke when you get married. Sexual orientation is a person's romantic and emotional attraction to another person. In humans, sexuality is intertwined with culture. While the norm, what is typical, like right-handedness is typical, while the norm in all industrial societies is heterosexuality, homosexuality is not uncommon, nor has it historically been uncommon. The New York Times, when the New York Times uses the word, it's good to go. The New York Times used the word gay for the first time in 1987. The paper adopted the term Ms. in 1986. Sexual orientation, figure 9-2 depicts the 4 sexual orientations. They are heterosexuality, homosexuality, asexuality, which is a lack of sexual attraction to anyone, and bisexuality. So on page 228, you need to know about sexual orientation evidence, a product of society or of biology. Well, a growing body of evidence suggests that it may be shaped at birth by biological factors such as brain structure and genes, which may also impact on hormone balance as we physically mature. 2, as is described in the text, there is also a social construct regarding homosexuality and its significance to a culture. So in terms of the social construction of homosexuality, did you know or care that up until about 100 years ago, there was no distinct category of people in America called homosexuals? They were just other people. Evidence at this time seems to indicate that it is a product of biology and that cultural influences do play a part. Okay, here's my take on it. To me, sexual orientation is on a continuum, as in more or less. And so everybody has a same-sex quotient to themselves, more or less. And to give you an example, the term homophobia means fear of sameness. Okay, so for those people who are homophobic, the idea here is that they are afraid of that part of themselves, that same sex quotient everybody has. You can say, okay, well then people who are bisexual are somewhere in the middle, where they're in touch with both their same-sex quotient and their other sex quotient. To give you yet another example, there's a video I show in one of my other courses, and in it they do an experiment. And they first of all get people who self-identified as being homophobic. Yes, I'm homophobic. Okay, could you please take this survey? Well, then they took the survey and it confirmed, yes, they do appear to be homophobic. They then said, okay, now, would you like to go on with the rest of the experiment? Yes, sure. So they brought them into a room and they wired a device to their penises, right? And then they showed these men different forms of pornography and then measured whether or not they got an erection. Now get this, guess what was the only type of pornography that stimulated the homophobics? That's right, men on men pornography. So homophobia literally means fear of sameness. During the time that America had the don't ask, don't tell policy in the military, which was running from 1993 to 2010, the don't ask, don't tell policy was enacted under Clinton. And the idea was if you're gay and we don't ask and you don't tell, you can stay in the military. Well, during that time, nearly 10,000 people were dismissed from the armed forces on grounds of sexual orientation, with an estimated cost of replacing them at some $200 million. Okay, well, first of all, at that time, you'll remember, it's still the case today, this is an all-volunteer army. And so there are 4 branches plus the Coast Guard that need to fill slots. So during this time period, there were many quarters when they couldn't fill all their quotas rather. And so they couldn't take anybody who claimed he or she was gay. So that eliminated that possibility. So instead they said, all right, we got to fill these quotas. So we'll start taking convicted felons instead. Hey, better to have a convicted felon than somebody who's a homosexual, huh? And besides, convicted felons are probably good with guns anyway. You know, this whole thing about, can we have gays in the military? You know, and I remember people arguing, saying, well, I don't want to be in a foxhole and know that somebody's same sex next to me. Well, first of all, dude, what's your assumption here that you are just so freaking powerfully charming that even in a foxhole, this person can't keep his hands off of you? Like, that's absurd. Let's go back into the history of America. Revolutionary War, there were gays in the military. Civil War, gays in the military. Spanish-American War, gays. World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, gays in the military. There always were gays in the military. It's never made any difference whatsoever. Okay, the gay rights movement on page 230. Homophobia, I'm going to give you another definition. Discomfort over close personal interaction with people thought to be gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Again, the term socially constructs reality in a pro-gay way. It kind of reminds me of, it does remind me of the late Senator Jesse Helms. I believe he was from North Carolina, got up on the Senate floor and said, I make no bones about it, I'm homophobic. And I remember a couple of days later, a gay comedian quipped, what's he afraid of? We're going to break in his home one night and redecorate? Okay. Marshall Kirk and Peter Madsen said the public denial of widespread homosexuality in the U.S. is like having 30 million human skeletons stuffed into a single closet. Check out figure 9-3 indicates how many gay people there are approximately in the United States and changing attitudes toward greater acceptance in the United States of homosexuality. It's actually remarkable to me that in a 10-year period of time, we went from the majority of the public opposing gay marriage to something like 63% supporting gay marriage, and hence state after state began to enact gay marriage, especially after the Supreme Court decision came down a few years ago that effectively said gay marriage is illegal in all the states. As of 1974, the American Psychological Association no longer deemed homosexuality a mental illness, instead defining it as a form of sexual behavior. Now, sometimes when we've had discussions in class, when we used to have discussions in class about gay marriage, the topic was brought up about should they have children? Of course. Anyway, when you have kids, a big concern is, can you afford kids? Gay couples earn more on average than do married heterosexual couples, about 1/3 more. As public awareness concerning non-traditional sexual orientation has escalated, an increasing number of controversial proposals has been made to include information regarding gay and lesbian lifestyles in public school curricula. Opponents of these proposals argue that teaching about homosexuality has the effect of condoning such morally unacceptable behavior. Some parents are concerned that this material is being introduced too early. In fact, in one school district, it was introduced as early as the first grade before administrators backed off and suggested the fifth or sixth grade health class might be more appropriate. Yeah, do you think first grade? Opponents to inclusive curricula have also objected to the placement of books in school libraries such as Heather Has Two Mommies, Daddy's Roommate, and Gloria Goes to Gay Pride. Many school districts allow students to be excused from classes in which homosexuality is discussed, although few parents take advantage of this option. Advocates of such inclusive programs in the curriculum argue that such information is especially important given the misinformation regarding AIDS and that gay bashing incidents remain common. Such instruction also helps gay students recognize, come to grips with their own sexual orientation. Perhaps you have heard of an organization called PFLAG. PFLAG is parents of gay students, homosexual students, and they initially had difficulty coming to grips with the fact that their child is homosexual. And so, you know, in time, most parents do love their kids. It doesn't matter what their sexual orientation is. And so they did, and now they help other parents who, when they find out that their child is, when the child is gay, that it helps them cope with that. Now, you may have noticed when I said gay lesbian lifestyles, I did the quotation mark things. And the reason why is, I remember one time we had Liz Bradbury. Liz Bradbury and her wife are in charge of the Bradbury Sullivan Center here in Allentown, which is an advocacy group for gay lesbian rights throughout Pennsylvania. But anyway, she came and addressed my class one time, and somebody mentioned gay lesbian lifestyles. And she corrected the student and said, you know, she said, that's an interesting term. She said, so you refer to it as a distinct chosen lifestyle, when in fact, the reason why there is such a thing as gay lesbian lifestyles is because you will not mainstream us. Therefore, we have to go to our own separate clubs, our own separate bars, take our own separate cruises, and then by default, you call that the gay lesbian lifestyle, like it's chosen. No, we want to do the same things everybody else does. Transgender, a broad concept that refers to appearing or behaving in ways that challenge conventional cultural norms concerning how females should look and act. It is not a sexual orientation. Transgender people may think of themselves as any of the 4 types of sexual orientation, or any combination of them, or in an entirely different fashion. Sexual controversies, teen pregnancy. How U.S. teen pregnancy compares to that of other Western industrialized nations. The U.S. is the highest. We're number 1. And National Map 9-2 shows the rates across the United States. Generally, teen birth rates are higher in states that have lower average incomes. The rate of pregnancy for 15 to 20-year-olds has gone down in America, but the pregnancy rate for younger girls has gone up. So we're talking like 11 to 13, 11 to 15. I remember some years ago, Planned Parenthood did a study of this phenomenon, and they found that the average time of conception was 3 to 5 in the afternoon. Remember, that's the time when you're out of school and your parents haven't come home yet. The time when I was playing doctor and nurse, for example. Lawman's research indicates that the modal is the typical age of first sexual intercourse in the United States is 16 for men and 17 for women. Pornography, sexually explicit material that causes sexual arousal. As is mentioned in the text, research does support the idea that pornography makes men think of women as objects rather than as people. Therefore, it becomes a power issue. You know, today there's hundreds of thousands of free erotic sites on the internet. You know, I think it's rather ironic that many of these pornography sites become infected with viruses. Prostitution, the selling of sexual services, the so-called world's oldest profession. Survey question. There is nothing inherently wrong with prostitution so long as the health risks can be minimized. If consenting adults agree to exchange money for sex, that is their business. Agree strongly, 15%. Agree somewhat, 24%. Disagree somewhat, 15%. Disagree strongly, 43%. Of course, 3% didn't know about that one either. The ancient Greeks had much the same prostitution hierarchy as we do now. Low-cost brothel workers occupied the lowest position. Street workers were only slightly more rewarded. And at the top, the elite call girls at the time, the heteri, which is Greek for hoe, were educated in the arts and philosophy and provided intellectual as well as sexual stimulation. Okay, well, there are women call girls like this today. Some years ago, the governor of New York, the then governor of New York, a guy named Spitzer, would travel down to Washington. He was married. He would travel down to Washington and pay $4,000 a night to be with one of these call girls who would provide intellectual as well as sexual stimulation at $4,000 a night. Anyway, the public found out about it and he had to leave office. And, you know, I think the only saving grace was he wasn't spending the state's money, just his and his wife's money. Did you know or care that prostitution was legal in the U.S. until 1909? Iowa was the first state to ban it, and by 1920, all states followed suit. So prostitution, drinking, you know, all being banned in the 1920s. You know, this was the don't have any fun period of American history. Now, some years ago, and in what state is it still legal? That's correct, Nevada. In Nevada, they have brothels. And some years ago, one of the brothels hired its first male prostitute. And they announced his rates. And for $100, he'll talk dirty to the partner. For $200, have sex with a partner. And for $300, he'll listen to her. Now, before I get cards and letters on that, it's just a joke. Listen, whether it's males or females, we all know somebody who will just talk your ear off, you know? But, you know, I know it's a stereotype, but there's comedy here and I'm going to go for it. You may remember Chris Rock, when he did his famous routine in Bigger and Blacker, pointed out how his girlfriend was one of those people who just won't stop talking. And so he said he don't mind talking to her. He said, but, you know, as soon as he puts his foot in the door, she already wants to talk about how her day went. He said, could I at least sit down and get a beer and then you can yak? And he said, it always starts off this way. And this is so true of so many men. You know, you ask a guy, how'd your day go? Whatever, fine. You know, and so his argument was, well, his girlfriend would just ask him, how was your day? So that she can launch into how was her day. And he said, then she just go on and on and on. He said, well, he said, I wasn't even paying attention. He said, I would just zone out. He said, but I would make it look like I was paying attention because I tossed in an occasional, you don't say, really? Get out. And then his favorite was, I told you the bitch be crazy, because he said, eventually every woman complains that some other woman's out to get her. Come on. And so he said to her, what do you mean somebody's out to get you at work? You wrap gifts at pennies. What, is somebody stealing your wrapping paper? Well, anyway, sexual violence, rape and date rape. Rape is a power issue rather than a form of sex. Public support for rape victims has prompted more women to come forward, a trend reflected in a steady rise in the number and percentage of forcible rapes reported to police in the 1980s and 1990s. According to the United States Bureau of Justice statistics, 3/4 of rapes are interracial. About 36% occur at the victim's home. Most multi-offender, in other words, gang rapes, are committed by men under 24 years of age. That was 62% of rapes. And police rearrest 52% of convicted rapists within 3 years. Well, that's why there's Megan's Law, and why sex offenders have to register, because it is sexual offenders are perhaps the most difficult people to provide therapy with pursuant to changing them. One of our graduates from the social work program, this is the kind of therapy she provides, and she rarely has a success story in terms of, getting adult sexual offenders to change their ways. Mostly, in a lot of respects, because they can't stop themselves. Some say, please just castrate me, I can't stop myself. Now, that's the downside. On the upside, there's also an organization here in the Valley where some of our former social work students now work, where they work with young, they don't use the term sexual offenders, but these are boys 10 to 12 who already have committed sexual offenses. And not surprisingly, they have been sexually offended when they were even younger. So they're just repeating the pattern that's been imposed upon them. They have a 100% success rate in getting these kids to end sexual offenses. So if you get the people young enough, you can change them. When they're older, it's very difficult to change them out of this pattern of sexual offense. Men also rape men, of course, and there are rare cases of women raping men. Again, these are expressions of power, not sex. So on page 234, you need to know about sexual violence, rape, and date rape. There are 2 myths you need to know. Myth number 1, rape involves strangers. Not so. 80% of rape victims knew the assailant. Myth number 2, this is especially regarding date rape, that women provoke their attackers. So the defense in court would be, see, she was, shall we say, sexually adventurous, and she had lots of partners, and so therefore she was just asking for it. And, that defense, I don't even know that it's used anymore, because it just makes no sense. The fact that somebody has had sex with multiple partners doesn't mean you're inviting rape. It's 2 different things. So it's kind of like blaming the victim for being the victim. There was a time at which I believe it was a fraternity brother at Lehigh raped a female student and got away with it, because at that time, throughout the entire process of the rape, she kept telling him to stop, no, stop. But technically, there was a legal loophole where no didn't mean stop legally. And so he got away with it. And so in a rare moment of unanimity, the Pennsylvania legislature closed that loophole in the law where no means no and it means stop. The only time there was that kind of unanimity in the Pennsylvania legislature was one time at about 1 a.m. They voted themselves a raise, figuring nobody will notice it. And the next day when the public found out that's what happened, they went ballistic. And some people claimed they were going to give back the raise, and on and on. It was great. Okay, you need to know the theoretical analysis of sexuality beginning on page 235, the structural functional analysis. What are the functions of sexuality? 1. The need to regulate sexual activity. Culture and social institutions regulate with whom and when people reproduce. Without this regulation, family life, especially the raising of children, would be threatened. This partly involves the incest taboo, which was described earlier in the chapter, as a norm forbidding sexual relations or marriage between certain relatives. Now, there is cultural variability as to exactly which family members are included in a society's incest taboo, but it is a cultural universal. So again, we use the term, it's universal but variable. Partly this is for biological reasons because reproduction between close relatives raises the risks of offspring with physical or mental problems. Yet only humans observe an incest taboo, so there are also cultural reasons for it. What may they be, Maynard? Number 1, it limits sexual competition in families by restricting sex to spouses. 2, it reduces kinship confusion, which is important because these family ties help define people's rights and responsibilities to one another. To give you an example, some years ago, did you ever hear the Rolling Stones? Yes, the Rolling Stones are probably the greatest rock and roll band ever. And you say, well, what about the Beatles? The Beatles were the greatest rock band ever. And that's a distinction made by Paul McCartney. Some years ago, the Rolling Stones' Bill Wyman, let's see if you can follow this. At the time, Bill Wyman was 58 years of age. His son, Stephen, who was 32, announced his intention of marrying the mother of his father's ex-wife. Okay, so Bill Wyman's ex-wife was 24 years old. He was 58, she was 24. So his son, Stephen, wanted to marry her mother, who was 45. Had this union taken place, Stephen would have become stepfather to his former stepmother. Bill would have been step-grandfather to his former wife. Bill would also be his son's son-in-law and the father of his father-in-law. Now that's kinship confusion. It kind of reminds me of that old country twangy song, "Oh, my own grandpa." And the guy goes through the whole thing and he describes the exact same thing as, so at the conclusion, he realizes that he's his own grandfather. It also reminds me, as does almost anything in life, of an episode of The Simpsons. As The Simpsons covers everything. Now, this was the episode, those of you who are Simpsons fans, where Maude Flanders got accidentally killed by Homer. And so it's a NASCAR race. And a recurring character in The Simpsons is Cletus, the slack-jawed yokel. So Cletus and his girlfriend are sitting in the back of the pickup truck, watching the race go around. And she turns to him and she says, "Nah, Cletus," she said, "we shouldn't be kissing in front of my ma and pa like this." And he says, "Well, why not? They're my ma and pa too." The Simpsons. National Map 9-1 indicates first cousin marriage laws in the U.S. So it varies from state to state. So if you're really interested in your kissing cousin, you can take him or her to the correct state and get married. 3, by requiring people to marry outside their immediate families, the incest taboo integrates the larger society as people look widely for partners to form new families. The social control of sexuality was historically related to childbirth. Thus came the terms legitimate and illegitimate childbirths. But with effective control on childbirths, technologically primarily, sex moved beyond its basic reproductive function and became accepted as a form of intimacy and even recreation in the US and elsewhere. Now, this is an important point because some people, when they argue against homosexuality, say, oh man, I love this one. God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. In other words, it's not natural for them to have sex together, but that's assuming that sex is only for reproduction. For heaven's sakes, does anybody chastise a heterosexual couple because they choose to not have kids? And so sex is also for intimacy and recreation. 2, the latent functions of sexuality. 1 is prostitution. Sociologist Kingsley Davis argued that prostitution is widespread now and has historically been so because it served a useful function for societies, despite the fact that it exploits women and spreads disease. He suggested that prostitution provides needed normal sexual activity for those in society who would have difficulty finding it otherwise. In so doing, it also prevents threats to the family structure that might ensue via other alternatives such as extramarital affairs. While the critical evaluation of the structural functional approach to sexuality is that this paradigm does help us to appreciate the role of sexuality in social organization. However, it offers little on the great diversity of sexual ideas and practices found within any society. Also, sexual patterns are not stable but change over time, and functionalist analysis sometimes ignores gender. So again, the standard critique of structural functionalism is it makes it sound like everything's the same everywhere when in fact it's not, it's culturally variable, and that patterns are not stable. Sexual patterns, like other patterns in society, change over time. Symbolic interaction analysis begins on page 287. Societies construct their views of sexuality, and thus they vary from society to society and they change over time. Notions about virginity before marriage have changed, as well as the need for sex education and when it should take place in schools has also changed over time. Also, there are widespread global differences in defining sexuality. Another interactional example is AIDS. Various precautions such as dentists wearing gloves and masks, and I noticed that trainers, athletic trainers, all wear they all wear latex gloves, began after the AIDS crisis, even though other diseases such as hepatitis are far more contagious and have been around far longer. This is probably because AIDS for so many years was defined as a gay disease. So yes, hepatitis is more contagious, but you didn't see doctors and dentists wearing gloves and masks about that. It was only with AIDS where they began to do it. And this was prior to COVID-19. Critical evaluation of the symbolic interaction approach. Not everything about sexuality is simply a variable social construct. Almost universally, men are more likely to see women in sexual terms than the other way around, which suggests the power of the broader social structure to limit and define the construction of reality. And finally, we have the social conflict and feminist analysis, which begins on page 238. Sexuality is related to patterns of social inequality. Number one, it reflects social inequality through the uneven enforcement of prostitution. Police are far more likely, for example, to arrest female prostitutes than they are male clients. In 1920, one analyst explained it this way: the professional prostitute, being a social outcast, may be periodically punished without disturbing the usual course of society. The man is something more than a partner in an immoral act. He discharges important social and business relations, is a father and brother responsible for the maintenance of others. He cannot be imprisoned without disrupting society. Oh, I see. Don't lock him up, just lock her up. Now, two things on that. Every now and then, as I scan the police report to see if it's anybody I know, and sometimes it is, every now and then they run a scam downtown where they have a female police officer pretend that she's a prostitute, and then they arrest anybody who attempts to solicit her. Now, the best part is they publish the names in the paper. So every now and then I've noticed when this happens, this police dragnet takes place, that sometimes a minister is caught up in it. And I always think, boy, I wonder what that sermon was like the following Sunday when everybody in the congregation knows he was just picked up trying to hook up with a prostitute in downtown Allentown. And I'm thinking, the sermon starts off with, "Now we all succumb to temptations of the flesh, and I am no exception." Yeah, keep going. Come on, talk your way out of this one. Okay. Also, as a side note, if we've had many students work with an agency here in the Valley that works with female offenders, and when the organization began, it worked exclusively with prostitutes before it, broadened its horizons and work with female offenders in general. But the idea was many of these women don't want to continue to be in prostitution. They got caught up in it, so to speak. They needed to make the money. And so they continue to do it, but they're not happy about doing it. Many have childbirths out of wedlock. Many of them do drugs because for many of them, it's the only way they can tolerate what they're doing. And so how do you get out of the vicious cycle? So while they're imprisoned, this agency begins to work with them, try to figure, okay, how can we get you a new life? And they kept adding new services on as they realized these women needed it. So they developed a halfway program where they can start working while they still live in a sheltered setting that's approved by the law. They help them to get an education. They help them to need a car, help them find a place to live to break the cycle of prostitution. For a while there, many of the prostitutes worked a circuit where they go from Atlantic City up into the Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area, over to Harrisburg, and then into Allentown, Lehigh Valley area, because they don't want to be in any one place at the same time because they get to be known and then they get picked up by the cops. Also, prostitutes are usually streetwalkers, and they are typically women with the least income, those most likely to be minorities, and who face the highest risk of rearrest. 2, sexuality is seen by social conflict theorists, especially feminists, as being at the root, being a cause of inequality between men and women. Women are devalued as full human beings when considered to be merely sex objects. Sexuality can and does degrade women. 3, also heterosexuals dominate homosexuals. This relates to the sociological term queer theory, a growing body of knowledge that challenges an allegedly heterosexual bias in sociology. It's a reaction to our heterosexist bias in society in terms of defining our everyday understanding of the world. Okay, so most ads feature heterosexual couples. And you notice I avoid this heterosexist bias. When we had this I gave you my informative discussion about how to marry rich, I said how to marry a rich sig other. That's being non-heterosexist. Critical evaluation of the social conflict point of view is this approach overlooks the fact that sexuality is not a power issue for everyone. Many couples have excellent sexual relationships that deepen their involvement and growth with one another. 2, the social conflict approach doesn't adequately consider the gains society has made in reducing and eliminating the injustice of male power over women. Also, acceptance of gays has grown in our society. Okay, now as I have suggested throughout these first 9 chapters, always check out the tables where these 3 paradigms are summarized. I think it gives you an instant understanding of the differences between the 3, and then you can go back and read again about each of the 3, but it gives you a quick overview, and then when you read back over it again, it gives you more in-depth understanding. So that table appears on page 239, where the 3 paradigms are compared. To show you how old this debate has been going on, the chapter ends with commentary on the continuing social debate on abortion, the deliberate termination of a pregnancy. Under the Trump administration, with more and more conservative judges being appointed positions throughout the country, more and more pro-life advocates are bringing cases up to the Supreme Court. Now, sometimes what they have tried to do in some of the states is cut off all forms of abortion, knowing it would be challenged in the courts, hoping it gets up to the Supreme Court, that under the current circumstances that the Supreme Court will have to make a decision as to whether or not to continue outlawing abortion under the Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade or not. The hope being that a more conservative Supreme Court will eventually overturn it. Anyway, here's a quote by Aristotle, again showing you how far back the debate on abortion goes on. He said, "If he was an ancient Greek, not an old Greek person, but back in, before the Christian era Greeks." He said, "If conception occurs in excess, have abortion induced before sense and life have begun in the embryo." Again, the argument about what trimester abortion can take place in, or trimesters. Okay, well, thus endeth chapter 9, and you now have all the preparation you need, at least from me, for the first cumulative exam, which covers chapters 1 to 9. And so I want to see a show of hands. How many are a little anxious about this exam? Well, you should be. I mean, hey, that's normal. All right, so let's examine this, shall we? Let me help you. All right, first of all, how's the exam work? There's going to be 55 questions, right? And you only have to answer any of the 50 questions. Let me put it another way. There's at least 5 questions you don't have to answer, and you'll still get the full score. Okay, so there's 55 questions, there's 5 you don't have to answer, and you'll still get the full score. Now, I don't care which 50 answer, and if you say, well, I'll just answer all 55, well, then I'm going to delete 5 from it. I'll delete questions 51 and 55 from the exam. They won't count. So pick out any 50 and just answer those questions. Second of all, with the exam, there's only one correct answer. I don't have in this set of exams all the above, none of the above. There's only one correct answer. Now, when you take these exams, multiple guess exams, usually you can look at it, the question, go, okay, I can eliminate those 2 right off the bat. Now it comes down to one or the other answer. First of all, trust your initial impulse. There's a reason why that came to you. Go with it. Trust your initial impulse. Second of all, because I find when I used to hand grade these exams, which obviously I'm not going to be doing when we do them online, but when I hand grade, I did it on purpose because I wanted to see how many people changed their first impression. They were correct, then they changed their mind, they were incorrect. Now, I'm not saying sometimes you might think about it longer and wait a minute, that's wrong, and change, but more often than not, you were correct. There's a reason why that popped into your head. Trust your head. Go with that first impulse. Also, again, I take these right out of a test bank because I think that they're fairly constructed. I don't trust my own abilities that, hey, I'm really great at constructing multiple choice exams and I know they're all fair questions. So my point being, the wording isn't designed to be tricky, but sometimes you have to carefully read the question, because sometimes after an exam, students will come back to me and say, Maynard, this is wrong because it asks this and this. And I said, what was your answer? Okay. I said, no, read the question again. You see, what it's asking is this, and you said this, and you go, yeah, I should have read it more carefully. Bingo. So read the question carefully. You have plenty of time to take the exam. You got 1 hour to take the exam. That is, historically, when I've given this, that's more than enough time. So you'll have enough time to take the exam. And again, there's a 5-point bonus question. All you have to do is answer it and you get 5 points. Yeah? So nobody is going to get less than a 5. You should feel good about that. Okay, now here's one other thing. I know it's hard for you to see this now, but this is how it works in this course. If you just get half the questions correct on all 3 exams, let's say you average getting a 50% on the 3 exams, and you submitted all your personal opinion statements on time, you did a great job in the discussions, and you got perfect attendance, you're going to end up getting at least a C or a C plus, even though you only got half the questions right. So I do this on purpose to take some of the onus off to effectively curve the exam. But that means you got to be doing the job, and on the personal opinion statements, you got to be doing the job on the discussions, and you got to be making 3 comments each week in the personal discussion, on the threaded discussions in order to get perfect attendance. So if you do those 3 things, then you will find that even if you only get half the questions right on each of the 3 exams, you're still going to pass this course. Woohoo! Now, let's get back to anxiety, shall we? This is another one of the living legends life lessons. Stress is one of the worst things you can do to yourself, which we'll talk about more when we get to health and society. But when you're anxious about an exam, what are you in effect saying about it? You're not going to do well, right? You wouldn't be worried if you thought you were going to do well. So anytime you're anxious, you're projecting forward, I'm not going to do well. Okay, so now you're worried. Okay, well, so let's say you've been worried for the last 2 weeks. Well, your body doesn't know the difference. So the minute you started worrying, you began create stress in your body, and you already automatically began tearing down your immune system for something that hasn't even happened yet. You know, it's 2 weeks away and you're already defeating your immune system's ability to protect you because of your stress. I'll give you another example. You may know it's called different things. It's called positive rehearsal and other names in sports, but it's well documented that it works. So the idea is great athletes, and I'll give you an example. Michael Jordan may be one of the most competitive professional athletes ever. If you ever watched that documentary on Michael Jordan, whoa, was he competitive. He would make up things just to spur his own competitiveness. Anyway, before every game, he would positively rehearse how he was going to play. Now, notice it said positively rehearse. So he didn't mentally rehearse, okay, I'm going to foul out and I'm going to miss every shot. Of course not. What he mentally rehearsed was how he was going to play the perfect game. Now, the perfect game is illusory. Few people have ever achieved perfection in sports performance, but sometimes they have. You've seen gymnasts score perfect 10s. And so the idea is you don't rehearse in advance that you're going to fail. You rehearse in advance how well you're going to perform. And it works in sports. Well, do you think that's just limited to sports? So when you are freaking out about an exam that hasn't even taken place yet, you're giving yourself negative rehearsal for how you're going to do instead of positive rehearsal. So think positively about this. Let's shift to another perspective, shall we? In the grand scheme of things, what does your performance in this test really matter? Not at all in the grand scheme of things. You know, so in the here's a great example. When I sit down with my advisors, I do it simply for my own amusement and their discomfort. I go, okay, well, now just remind me, what courses are you taking this semester? It usually takes a student 30 seconds or so to recollect what the student is currently taking. Okay, so do you honestly think that 1 year from now, 2 years from now, you're going to remember what score you got on the first exam? You know, and when you graduate from college, are you going to remember every course you ever took? You know, I'll just be a distant memory. You know, he had long hair and he never stopped talking. He thought he was so funny, but he wasn't. I'm going to remember. Unless you need a recommendation from me, then you'll remember until they give you the recommendation. Then you can forget about me again. So anyway, it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of your life. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Maynard, you don't understand. I want to be a nursing major, and I have to pass this course in order to be a nursing major. What if I don't pass this course? Then I say, how do you know? What, is this now the end of your life? See, here's the problem. Don't get too wed to your plans. So, for example, I'm going to be a nurse. Yeah, that's your plan, but you don't know what life has in store for you yet. That may or may not be what happens. You have to trust the force, trust the process. Life is unfolding exactly as it must for you. And so if for some reason you don't pass sociology, there's a reason for that. And because maybe later on you won't pass micro, you won't pass A&P. And so, hey, you can't be a nurse. And so that's okay. What happens all the time, because there's always social work. We're the Ellis Island of majors. Bring me your poor, your huddled masses, yearning for a career. That's us. Okay, so many is the time when I've met with a student who is no longer in the nursing program and not by choice. And so initially the student's all pissed off. It's the nursing faculty's fault, not mine. Okay, whatever. And so, you know, okay, but you want to help people, right? Yeah, okay, well, why don't you help them in social work? Okay. And so many times we have placements in medical settings. And so this student takes a medical placement and graduates and is really happy to be a social worker. Now, that same student will reflect back on, Maynard, when I met with you, I thought that was one of the worst days of my life. Well, I get that a lot when people meet with me, but she was reflecting on the fact that she had to change careers. And so, okay, but now she realizes it all happened for a reason and it took her in the direction she really needed to go, which was social work, which becomes her lifelong work and love of her career. So you never know. Don't get so wed to your plans. Everything is unfolding in your life exactly as it needs to in order to get you where you need to be. So you have to trust life, trust the process. Okay, so get rid of your anxiety. Think positively about how you're going to do. You know, when you're done with this exam, here's the attitude I want you to have. I want you to look at that exam and you get done with it and you go, now who's your mama, bitch? Are you with me, everybody? All right, nail that exam. I'll be back again after the exam with chapter 10. Later, kids. Bye.